A shadow fell over Yorkshire in the late 1970s. Women were terrified to walk the streets, families locked their doors, and the police seemed powerless.
Peter Sutcliffe changed the way people lived.
For 5 years, a faceless killer struck again and again, until his name became infamous: Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. But here's the chilling truth: the Ripper was stopped not by brilliant detective work, but almost by accident. What went wrong? And how many lives could have been saved? Stay with us to uncover the real story, and if you want more untold stories like this, make sure you're part of our archive by subscribing. Police hunted the Ripper with everything they had: thousands of interviews, endless hours of patrols, even secret undercover operations. Yet, time and again, he slipped through their fingers. Was it sheer cunning, or a catastrophic failure of justice? And when the trial finally came, the world saw not just a murderer, but a system on trial. The evidence, the outrage, and the chilling testimony, all revealed in court.
We're on family now, and let's get on with our lives with a bit more peace, shall we say, after today.
While women were dying on the streets, one man, not the Ripper, misled the entire police force. A faceless hoaxer whose cruel prank cost lives. Who was he, and why did he do it? Stay with us, because his shocking identity will be revealed later in this documentary. 9 interviews. 9 chances to stop him. And 9 failures that cost lives. Peter Sutcliffe, the man the world would come to know as the Yorkshire Ripper, slipped through the police net time and again. While women were dying, the police were chasing a ghost, a hoaxer who tricked an entire nation. The so-called Wearside Jack letters and tapes misled detectives for years, costing precious lives. But the question everyone whispered: were the victims being blamed for their own murders? Instead of stopping a killer, society pointed fingers at the women themselves. In the end, the Ripper wasn't caught by genius, but by chance. A routine stop. A forged number plate. And suddenly, Britain's most wanted man was in handcuffs. And in court, when the evidence was revealed, silence fell. The world finally saw the true face of evil. The trial would not only expose a murderer, but a system that had failed an entire nation. But to understand how the Ripper reigned for so long, we must go back to his first victims, the warnings that were missed, and the voices that went unheard. She was only 14, walking home from a friend's house. A hammer blow struck her skull, blood poured down her face, and yet she lived to tell the tale. Tracy Brown was the first known survivor of the Yorkshire Ripper. And she would not be the last. In the summer of 1975, Tracy Brown, just a child, walked through the quiet streets of Silsden. Behind her, Sutcliffe stalked silently. Without warning, he raised a hammer and struck. Tracy collapsed, bleeding, but somehow managed to crawl to safety. She survived with a fractured skull, her life hanging by a thread. But here's the tragedy: when she reported her attack, police treated it as an isolated case. No pattern, no urgency. A survivor's voice, silenced by disbelief. Only weeks later, in Halifax, Olive Smelt was walking home after visiting a friend. A man emerged from the shadows: Sutcliffe. Again, the hammer fell. Olive was left with severe head injuries. Her husband found her bloodied and dazed. She survived, but police doubted her memory, suggesting stress or confusion. Olive's truth, like Tracy's, was brushed aside. Later that same year, Anna Rogolskij in Keighley was viciously attacked. With a hammer, then slashed her body with a knife. She required extensive surgery but miraculously survived. Anna described her attacker clearly. Yet, her testimony didn't trigger alarm. Police remained convinced these women's accounts weren't linked. In 1976, Marcella Claxton was walking home from a party in Leeds. She accepted a lift from Sutcliffe, a fateful mistake. He attacked her brutally with a hammer. Marcella survived but lost her unborn child due to the assault. Her description of Sutcliffe was strikingly accurate. But because she was a young black woman, police dismissed her. Her pain was treated as less important, her survival as coincidence. And yet, her account could have ended the nightmare before it escalated. Tracy Brown, Olive Smelt, Anna Rogalskij, Marcella Claxton, and others, Marilyn Moore, Maureen Leah, Teresa Sykes. 9 women in total survived Sutcliffe's wrath. 9 voices that could have stopped him. 9 warnings lost in the noise of a failing investigation. Why were these women not believed? Why were their stories pushed aside? The truth lies in the attitudes of the time. Most of Sutcliffe's victims were sex workers. Police assumed the danger was confined to a certain type of woman. Survivor accounts were downplayed, their words ignored. But in December 1977, everything changed. Jane MacDonald, a 16-year-old shop assistant, was murdered. She was not a sex worker. She was seen as respectable. And suddenly, the police, and the public, panicked. Now, every woman in Yorkshire felt unsafe. Families locked their doors. Girls stopped walking alone. The killer wasn't just preying on sex workers. No one was safe. The survivors of the Yorkshire Ripper carried physical scars, but also the heavier burden of being ignored. Their voices could have ended the terror. Instead, their warnings fell into silence, silence by prejudice, by police failures, by society itself. Imagine, if Tracy's words had been trusted, if Marcella's testimony had been pursued, if Olive's attack had been fully investigated, how many women would still be alive? The Ripper's crimes are remembered. But the survivors' courage deserves equal recognition. They were not just victims. They were the missed chances to stop him. But survival told only half the story. The murders that followed would plunge Yorkshire into terror, and expose the catastrophic failures of justice. A shadow fell over Yorkshire in the late 1970s. Women clutched their handbags tighter, glanced over their shoulders, and walked faster through the dark streets of Leeds and Bradford. Mothers warned daughters not to go out. Families locked their doors earlier than ever before. The killer later became infamous as the Yorkshire Ripper. But in 1975, nobody yet knew his name. They only knew the fear. Wilma was 28 years old, a mother of 4 young children. On the night of October 29th, she had been out drinking in Leeds. As dawn broke, her body was discovered near her home, brutally beaten and stabbed. The Guardian in 1975 reported, a young mother of 4, murdered within sight of her children's home. A city wakes in horror. Her children, just yards away, woke to find their mother gone forever. This was the Ripper's first known victim. But detectives labeled it as a local crime, not part of a pattern. And society, cruelly, whispered, she lived a chaotic life, she drank too much, she walked alone. Already, victim blaming had begun. Victim 2, Emily Jackson, January 1976. Just 3 months later, another woman was targeted. Emily Jackson, aged 42, lived in Morley. To help her struggling family, she sometimes worked as a sex worker. On a freezing January night, she accepted a lift from a man in a car. That man was Peter Sutcliffe. He drove her to a desolate location, struck her with a hammer, and stabbed her repeatedly with a screwdriver. The brutality shocked even seasoned officers. Daily Mirror in 1976 wrote, "This was not the work of an ordinary criminal. This was the work of someone who kills with hatred." Yet the police focused narrowly. They assumed, this is a problem of the red light district. To them, respectable women were safe. In working-class communities, fear began to spread, but it was selective. An ITV Street interview in 1976 captured women saying, "If you're a decent woman, you'll be all right. It's only the prostitutes he's after." That cruel assumption gave women false confidence, and gave Sutcliffe freedom to strike again. From the very beginning, the narrative around these women, drinking, working nights, or sex work, meant their murders were treated differently. Their voices, their lives, their humanity, diminished. Detectives interviewed thousands of men in Leeds and Bradford. Sutcliffe himself. He was interviewed in this early period, and released. Failure number 1. The start of 9 missed chances. The first 2 murders showed a pattern: women alone at night, attacked with a hammer, stabbed repeatedly. But because the victims were dismissed as a certain type of woman, the investigation did not escalate. And that was the Ripper's greatest shield, society's indifference. The killer had begun his reign, and women were left to wonder if they could ignore Wilma and Emily, whose daughter would be next. By 1977, whispers of fear had turned into a roar. The streets of West Yorkshire were haunted by a shadow, but many still believed the danger was confined to a certain kind of woman. That belief would soon be shattered forever. Victim 3, Irene Richardson, February 1977. Irene, a 28-year-old mother of 3, was last seen in Leeds. She was struck down with the familiar weapon, a hammer, and her body was mutilated with a knife. Yorkshire Evening Post, 1977, described the crime scene as a place of unspeakable violence. The marks of hatred carved into her body, but still, police clung to the notion that these were attacks on sex workers alone. Society looked away. Victim 4, Patricia Tina Atkinson, April 1977. Patricia, 32, was killed in her own flat in Bradford. Unlike earlier victims found outside, her murder showed Sutcliffe was becoming bolder. He left behind bloody footprints from his size 7 boots, evidence later crucial in his conviction. The murder that changed everything, Jane MacDonald, June 1977. Then came the night of June 26, 1977. Jane MacDonald, just 16 years old, was walking home in Leeds after visiting friends. She was not a sex worker. She was a schoolgirl with her whole life ahead of her. When her body was discovered, struck with a hammer and stabbed in the same brutal pattern, everything changed. BBC News, 1977, reported live, "The Ripper has claimed an innocent. No woman, no daughter, no sister is safe." The press exploded. Fear that had been selective now spread everywhere. Middle-class families panicked. Parents forbade daughters from going out at night. Suddenly, the Yorkshire Ripper was no longer someone else's problem. Yet at the time, investigators missed the chance to connect the dots. Jane's murder shattered the illusion that only immoral women were at risk. From this point, Sutcliffe's crimes weren't just attacks, they were an assault on an entire community's sense of safety. Headlines screamed, "The Ripper stalks Leeds." Women marched demanding protection. Police patrols doubled. But the damage was done. Marcella Claxton's ignored testimony, Jane MacDonald's tragic death, and the earlier victims all revealed one truth: police failures were mounting, and the killer was still free. The Ripper's reign had escalated. More victims, more survivors, more missed chances. And in the months to come, the manhunt would grow desperate, and yet, Peter Sutcliffe would still walk among them. By late 1977, the Yorkshire Ripper had already left a trail of horror, yet somehow, Peter Sutcliffe remained free. Not because he was invisible. Not because he was untouchable. But because, time and again, the police stood inches away from the truth, and still let him slip away. It was in October 1977 that Sutcliffe murdered Jean Jordan, a 20-year-old mother and sex worker from Manchester. After killing her, he panicked. He realized he had given her a brand new £5 note from his wages. That note could link him to the crime. 9 days later, Sutcliffe returned to Jean's hidden body. He mutilated her further, desperate to retrieve that incriminating note. But he failed. The note remained. Police traced it. It had been issued to only a few factories in Yorkshire, including Sutcliffe's workplace at Clark Transport. They interviewed more than 5,000 men. Peter Sutcliffe's name was on the list. But somehow, he didn't stand out. He was questioned, and released. It was a golden opportunity, the closest detectives had come to catching the Ripper. And yet, the chance was lost. And Jean wasn't the only missed opportunity. There were women who lived, women who had seen the Ripper's face, felt his hammer, survived his violence. Marcella Claxton, attacked in May 1976, gave police a detailed description. She even described his dark beard and accent. But because she was a single mother, considered not respectable, her testimony was dismissed. Tracy Brown, just 14 years old, was walking home from a friend's house when Sutcliffe struck her with a hammer. She miraculously survived with a fractured skull. She too went to the police. But detectives brushed her aside. How many lives might have been saved if their words had been taken seriously? At the time, investigators carried a dangerous assumption, that the Ripper was only targeting sex workers. Women outside that category? They believed they were safe. Police believed they were irrelevant. The press began to take notice. The Guardian published in 1977, "How many times can a killer be interviewed and set free?" Families of victims expressed outrage. Women's groups marched through the streets of Leeds and Bradford, chanting, "No more murders." They demanded protection, demanded action. Why was Sutcliffe so difficult to catch? Not because he was a mastermind, but because his motives slipped through the cracks of 1970s policing. Later, psychologists would describe him as a mission-oriented killer. Sutcliffe himself claimed that the voice of God had commanded him to rid the world of prostitutes. Forensic psychologist David Cantor, who later studied the case, explained, "Sutcliffe was not a clever man. He was an ordinary lorry driver. But his ordinariness was his camouflage. Police were looking for a monster. What they missed was the man next door." This insight would eventually lead to the development of offender profiling in Britain. But in the 1970s, those tools didn't exist. And without them, Sutcliffe continued to kill. Each mistake, each ignored survivor, each failed interview, all added up. By 1978, Sutcliffe had been interviewed by the police not once, not twice, but 9 separate times. And 9 times, he walked free. And just as public fear reached boiling point, something even more sinister happened. A voice appeared on tape. A hoaxer calling himself the Ripper. And while women kept dying on the streets of Yorkshire, the police, desperate for a breakthrough, began to chase a ghost. By 1978, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation was unraveling under its own weight. Thousands of men had been interviewed, files stacked floor to ceiling in West Yorkshire Police Headquarters. But the killer was still free, and the pressure on detectives was unbearable. And then, a new voice entered the case. Anonymous letters began arriving at police stations and local newspapers. They were taunting, cruel, written in a tone of superiority, signed, simply, Jack the Ripper. And then, the most dangerous twist of all, a cassette tape. In 1979, police headquarters received an audio recording. A man with a strong Wearside, northeast England, accent spoke calmly into the microphone, "I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. The effect was instant. It was chilling. Television news ran the recording across the country. ITV News, 1979, declared, "The Yorkshire Ripper has spoken." Families gathered around their sets, listening to the voice of what they believed was the nation's most feared killer. But here's the truth, that wasn't Peter Sutcliffe. Survivors of real attacks knew it immediately. Women like Marcella Claxton and Marilyn Moore, who had seen Sutcliffe's face and heard his voice, told police, "That is not him. Our attacker had a Yorkshire accent, not Wearside." But their warnings were dismissed. Why? Psychologists later called it confirmation bias. Detectives had been searching for years without success. They were exhausted, under immense political pressure, and desperate for a breakthrough. When the tape arrived, it seemed like a gift, tangible proof, a direct communication from the killer himself. Their minds latched onto it. Dr. David Cantor, one of the earliest criminal profilers in Britain, later explained, "The police became victims of tunnel vision. The hoax fit their need for answers. They were no longer investigating evidence, they were investigating a story." Chief Constable George Oldfield himself became convinced this was the real Ripper. He even played the tape at press conferences, appealing to the public for help identifying the voice. Resources were diverted. Entire teams were sent chasing Leeds in Sunderland, hundreds of miles from where the actual murders were happening. And while police were chasing a ghost, Sutcliffe continued to kill. The media, too, fell into the trap. The Daily Mail wrote, "At last, the Ripper speaks." Meanwhile, The Guardian warned, detectives may be chasing a phantom. But the louder, more sensational headlines drowned out the doubt. The voice on the tape was later revealed to belong not to a serial killer, but to a drunk hoaxer named John Humble, nicknamed Wearside Jack. He sent the letters and tape as a cruel prank, never imagining the catastrophic consequences. But those consequences were real. Investigators lost years. Women lost their lives. And Sutcliffe gained the cover of police distraction. Think about it, have you ever wanted something to be true so badly, that you ignored the warning signs? That's what happened here. It's called confirmation bias. The police weren't following the evidence anymore, they were following their own hope. And that hope cost lives. While women were dying, the police were chasing a ghost. And that mistake gave Sutcliffe freedom to kill again. By 1978, the Ripper was no longer a shadow haunting only the red light districts. His attacks were spreading, more brutal, more unpredictable. And with each new victim, Yorkshire's fear grew darker. It was January 1978 when Yvonne vanished from the streets of Bradford. Days later, her body was discovered, stuffed beneath an abandoned sofa, her skull shattered by Sutcliffe's hammer. He had covered her face with newspaper, almost as if trying to erase her identity. The Yorkshire Post reported, "A young woman, discarded like rubbish. A human life, hidden away as though it meant nothing." This wasn't just murder. It was a grotesque message, he was killing with confidence. Just weeks later, Helen, a teenager working the streets of Huddersfield, was lured by Sutcliffe. He struck her with the hammer and dumped her body behind a timber yard. Detectives noted how calm the killer seemed. He didn't just vanish into the shadows, he left her in a busy area, almost daring the police to catch him. But they didn't. In May 1979, the Ripper's violence reached Manchester. Vera was attacked in the grounds of Manchester Royal Infirmary, a hospital, a place where people sought safety and healing. Instead, Vera's body lay mutilated in a car park. Newspapers called it a murder in the heart of trust. For the first time, people realized, not even hospitals, lit and guarded, were safe. Then came September 1979. Barbara, a university student in Bradford, was walking home after an evening out with friends. Sutcliffe struck her, hid her body in a shallow grave behind a house. She was not a sex worker, not in a dangerous area, not alone in the middle of the night. She was an ordinary student, and that made her murder a national shock. The Guardian wrote, "Barbara's death is a turning point. This is not a killer of the margins. This is a killer of everyone." By now, the entire region was gripped by panic. BBC Panorama in 1979 aired women saying, "We live in fear. We can't walk home. We can't go out at night." Parents refused to let daughters travel alone. Taxi businesses boomed because no woman wanted to walk. Groups of women organized marches, demanding police protection, demanding to be heard. But despite the outcry, the killer struck again. Marguerite Walls, 47 years old. August 1980. A civil servant, respectable, middle class, walking home from work in Leeds. She too was bludgeoned to death. The newspapers were blunt, "The Ripper has destroyed the myth of safety. Every woman is a target." Jacqueline Hill, 20 years old. In November 1980, Jacqueline, a student at Leeds University, was found murdered after leaving a bus stop. Just like Jane MacDonald before her, Jacqueline's death brought waves of fury. Students protested on campuses. The Daily Mail headline read, "No daughter is safe. The Ripper walks among us." Closing the murder chapter. Between 1978 and 1980, Peter Sutcliffe murdered at least 6 more women, from teenagers to mothers, sex workers to students. No pattern, no safety net, no one could predict his next strike. The public's fear had become hysteria. Police resources were stretched to breaking point. And yet, despite eyewitnesses, boot prints, tire tracks, even a traceable £5 note, Sutcliffe was still walking free. His murders were no longer just crimes in the dark. They were a mirror, reflecting society's blindness, sexism, and failure to protect half its population. But murder wasn't the only horror. Some women survived his attacks, scarred, traumatized, but alive. And their voices could have stopped him. If only the police had listened. For years, Peter Sutcliffe walked free, because the voices that could have stopped him were buried. Voices of women who lived to tell the tale. Take Marcella Claxton. She was attacked with a hammer in 1976, left bleeding with a fractured skull. But she survived. Marcella gave a detailed description of her attacker, his beard, his build, even the type of car he drove. She remembered his Yorkshire accent. But the police didn't believe her. Why? Because Marcella wasn't considered respectable. Her testimony was quietly filed away. Then there was Tracy Brown, just 14 years old, attacked with a hammer while walking home. She survived too, her young voice trembling as she described her attacker. But detectives dismissed her story, saying it didn't fit their theory. And Maureen Leah. Marilyn Moore, more women who survived the hammer blows, more voices ignored. Each one could have been the key. Each one could have stopped him years before. Think about this, if even one of those women had been taken seriously, if even one file had been followed through, Peter Sutcliffe might have been stopped after 2 murders, not 13. Instead, it would take 5 more years, and countless lives lost, before he was finally caught. And when it happened, it wasn't the result of brilliant detective work. It wasn't the outcome of a grand investigation. It was January 2, 1981. Sutcliffe was pulled over by 2 routine officers in Sheffield for driving with false license plates. In the back of his car, they noticed screwdrivers, a hammer, tools of his murders. Suspicion grew. Within days, under questioning, Sutcliffe broke. He confessed. After years of fear, bloodshed, and mistakes, it ended not with genius, but with chance. The arrest was pure coincidence. And yet, for the families of the victims, it was the moment they had prayed for. But justice came late. Too late for 13 women. Too late for the survivors who had been ignored. What do you think? If survivors had been heard earlier, would the Yorkshire Ripper have been caught years before? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're finding this story eye-opening, subscribe so we can keep bringing these hidden truths into the light. The trial of Peter Sutcliffe began in May 1981. For the first time, Britain heard the full horror spoken aloud in a courtroom. The prosecution laid it bare: 13 women murdered, at least 7 more brutally attacked and left for dead. Their names, their injuries, their final moments, read aloud in chilling detail. The survivors were called to testify. Women who had lived through the hammer blows, standing in front of Sutcliffe, pointing to the man who had left them scarred for life. Imagine the courage it took to face him again. Families of the murdered sat in silence, listening to the unimaginable. Mothers clutching handkerchiefs. Fathers with faces carved in grief. Brothers and sisters, broken by loss. BBC court reporter Robert Key wrote, "Never before has a British court heard such chilling, systematic violence against women." Sutcliffe's defense claimed he was mentally ill, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He said he believed he was on a mission from God to cleanse the streets of prostitutes. But the jury didn't accept it. They saw not a madman, but a murderer. A man who planned, who stalked, who killed with purpose. In May 1981, Peter Sutcliffe was found guilty of 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he never be released. But even with the verdict, there was no celebration. Only outrage. Outrage that it had taken so long. Outrage that warnings were ignored, that survivors were silenced, that women had to die before the system took notice. Because by then, the truth was clear: Peter Sutcliffe was only part of the horror. The rest was the failure of institutions that were supposed to protect. If you had been on that jury, what would you have decided: life in prison, or treatment in a hospital for the criminally insane? Tell us in the comments. When Peter Sutcliffe was finally locked away, Britain should have breathed a sigh of relief. But instead, a different question echoed across the nation: how could it have taken so long? In 1981, the Bradford Report, an official government inquiry, was released. Its findings were damning. It revealed appalling police failures, more than 20 separate opportunities where Sutcliffe could have been stopped. Evidence ignored. Survivors dismissed. Leads dropped. The report concluded that if the investigation had been handled properly, at least 7 women might still be alive. Think about that: 7 families spared the knock on the door, 7 daughters who might have grown old, 7 voices never silenced. The Yorkshire Ripper case changed British policing forever. It forced reforms in how serial cases were investigated. It exposed how sexism and class prejudice cost lives. And it reminded us that behind every headline was a real woman, a mother, a sister, a daughter. Today, the victims' names are remembered. But the deeper lesson remains: justice is not just about catching the killer. It's about listening to every voice, no matter who it belongs to. If you've stayed with us this far, you're part of this archive. Hit subscribe, so the next untold story is never lost in the shadows. And tell us in the comments, what do you think is the real legacy of the Yorkshire Ripper case: Sutcliffe's crimes, or society's failures?